What's up guys, it's me Lumos Theromax. Be sure to like and subscribe to both myself and the coffee shop content creators down below, link in the description. And today we just have a really quick video on the most foundational energies that exist inside all of DC. These foundational energies are simply known as anticrisis energies, also connective energies, as well as crisis energies, which are much more supportive of like the concepts of doom. Starting off with the positive connective energies, we have the 7 primal forms of energies that all things operate off of. Also known as anticrisis energies, as I stated earlier, you may recognize these forces as many of the mainstay Justice League's power sets. Which is interesting. Keep in mind, this is just the super simplified version, so I'm not going to be going into like anything wildly insane. I'll save that for my dope cosmology building for a little bit later. So the first foundational energy we're going to discuss today is the Speed Force. And the Speed Force itself is what gives everything in creation its motion and is often associated with the Flash, obviously, you know, him running super fast and everything along those lines. Like many people, or like many of the other energies you'll see on this list too, the Speed Force is something that is omnipresent or exists everywhere within a creation in DC. And that's important to remember. Following up with that, we have the Sphere of Gods, energies, which essentially represents the possibility of the collective unconsciousness. Magic and gods are born from this idea and concept, such as like Zeus, or like Wonder Woman, or like Zatanna replicating their magics, for example. The life force, which is something entirely separate from the life entity that has to do with the emotional spectrum, is a concept or energy that connects all living beings and their souls, and its origin happens to be inside the ocean. The collective unconscious is the foundational energy that grants us knowledge and like telepathy and the mind in general. Powerful telepaths, obviously, such as like Martian Manhunter, utilize this energy rather potently. The dimensional superstructure is like the foundational building blocks that hold together a creation. They're like the cement holding together like bricks that make up a verse. That would be like the best way I could kind of phrase that. The only people we know of that utilize this this energy would be like the monitors from like the monitor sphere. We also have faithfulness, which is essentially this harmonious force tied to doing the right thing and justice. Also like heroism. And if any of the League's members really embody this, I mean, obviously this looks like a job for Superman. Let's face it. He represents the idea of faithfulness as best as he possibly could. And last but not least, we have the emotional spectrum, which appears to be a little bit different than some of the other foundational energies we've really like gone over up into this point. Because unlike all the other ones, all the other foundational energies that we've seen so far that exist omnipresent across all of our creation, the emotional spectrum is something that does that as well, but like the emotional spectrum itself is located behind the source wall. And the source wall is this thing that encloses everything with, or did enclose everything within the concept of all of DC. So yeah, it sits kind of out beyond that and exists on a higher plane, I guess, and it exists across all creations within like the quote unquote light, or at least that's what's being implied by that. And obviously, like, you have Green Lantern being a good representative like on the Justice League of somebody who utilizes this power specifically. And also the life entity comes from the emotional spectrum as well, and the life entity is the literal representation of the life or light that came to our reality in the first place, that all life came from, and that would include like the idea of like the life force down the road. Now, as I stated at the beginning of this, each one of these 7 foundational energies actually have a fundamental and polar opposite like power set, I guess, or like there's like a polar opposite side to the spectrum to their abilities. And the first energy we covered earlier was like the Speed Force. So let's kind of discuss the spectrum that exists along the ideas of the Speed Force, because it's not just speed that exists there. We also have like the Strength Force. And then we also have like this still force being the polar opposite, I guess, to the idea of the speed force. And whereas the speed represents motion, the still force represents like non-motion, or like the idea of negating motion or reducing entropy. Yeah, it's like the best way to kind of phrase it. And for the life force, we have the tier of extinction representing its opposite. And the tier of extinction, I mean, obviously can just destroy and like kill anything like it comes across. It obviously represents the opposite of the life force, or the connective material between the soul and like the body. The tier of extinction lives up to its name, even killing like gods whenever it comes across them. It's pretty wild stuff. The opposite power set to the collective unconscious is the black apple of forbidden knowledge, essentially, and that's what it represents, even for the mind, knowledge that no one is meant to have under any circumstance. The sixth note, or the opposite to the dimensional superstructure, represents the idea of something beyond imagination, or something beyond possibility, and thus it's like the foil, I guess, to the structure of everything imaginable or possible. Faithlessness, the opposite to faithfulness, is the idea of giving up on justice and essentially just giving into doom itself. Giving up in the faith of others and just giving up into pure like selfishness. I think that's like the best way to kind of phrase it. Lex Luthor was a perfect avatar of this power whenever he became like Apex Lex, for example, and was serving Perpetua. And of course, for the emotional spectrum, last but not least, we have the invisible spectrum, also known as the ultraviolet spectrum or the ultraviolet core, which is led by the emotional entity known as Umbrax. And Umbrax and his core essentially feed on like the primal emotions that exist on people, most notably like their hatred of themselves, like grief, agony, or like hatred, most specifically of themselves. It definitely feels like centered. Or at least it did with Jon Stewart. Maybe that's just because that's who he is, but that's kind of where we were going with it. So, naturally, the presence who issues these source energies, all of these foundational energies, to the hands, and they go and create multiverses inside the overvoid, or like the white light, or like the omniverse that exists within DC, to like coalesce all those terms together, because DC can't seem to get their terminology straight when it comes to those things. So they go out and they create these multiverses using traditionally the 7 positive forces, or like the good ones typically associated with the Justice League, but like a really twisted evil celestial named Perpetua said, yo, fuck that shit, I like crisis energies over connective or anticrisis energies, and she created our verse out of crisis energies, which are like the more twisted versions that you obviously saw like the Legion of Doom wield within that like 2018 Justice League storyline. So in this new DC book, we see a really interesting I'm gonna say, like, it's not a chart or anything along those lines, but a really interesting picture explaining the dichotomy between all of these like power sets, I guess, or like foundational energies, and how they function and correlate with one another. And I think that it's really interesting that the emotional spectrum is kind of stated to be outside of all of that, or at least demonstrated to be within this image. But I think it's really cool to look at these things and see how they kind of play out across all of creation. And I'm really curious to see kind of where they take the stories with these, and they'll all kind of wind up transcending that omniverse, or not transcending, but at least existing out inside of that to a higher level down the road. Either way, I hope you guys learned something new, and I hope you guys found out something really cool. And hopefully DC decides to dig a little bit more into the fun side of cosmology, and we'll get to see what happens down the road. Either way, be sure to like and subscribe to both myself and the coffee shop content creators down below. Links in the description, as well as my other homies too, man. I got some really cool guys working with me. And I guess with no further ado, I'll see you next time, Lanterns. Later.